"I can't marry him." Diana said those words before the wedding, before the vows, before 750 million people watched her walk down the aisle, believing they were witnessing the perfect love story. She'd just opened a package someone had told her not to touch. Inside was a gold bracelet meant for Camilla Parker Bowles. Engraved on it were 2 letters Diana believed carried a message she wasn't supposed to understand. She understood it immediately, and when she turned to her sisters for help, their answer told her something even more frightening than what she'd found inside that box. The wedding was already bigger than her doubts, but the bracelet wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the moment everything Diana had noticed, every look, every phone call, every name dropped a little too casually, finally came together. You'll hear how Charles and Diana's courtship began, and why Camilla was already standing inside their relationship before it had a chance to take shape. You'll learn what was engraved on that bracelet, why Charles's circle offered a completely different explanation, and what Diana actually told her sisters when she thought she couldn't go through with the wedding. Then there's the woman Diana spotted inside the cathedral, and the second gift she discovered on her honeymoon, because by the time Diana opened that package, the warning signs had been there for months. She just hadn't been able to hold one in her hands until now. If you believe Diana's story deserves the truth, not the headlines, like this video and subscribe. Now, let's go back to where the warning signs really began. Before we start, you should know where this story comes from, because Diana's life has been retold so many times that the truth often gets buried under television scenes, recycled rumors, and details nobody has ever actually proved. The strongest starting point is Diana herself. In 1991, she recorded a series of private interviews through her trusted friend, Dr. James Coldhurst, who passed her answers to biographer Andrew Morton. Those recordings helped shape Morton's 1992 book. Later editions included full transcripts, letting the public hear Diana's version in her own words. That matters. We're not relying on somebody claiming they knew what she felt. We're working with what Diana said she remembered. But there's always the other side. Jonathan Dimbleby received authorized access to Charles's perspective for a separate biography. Charles's former aide, Michael Colborne, gave details that sometimes contradict Diana's interpretation, and journalist Penny Junor has consistently offered a more sympathetic reading of Charles's actions. So throughout this video, we'll keep those differences visible. Diana's recollections, documented public facts, and Charles's account aren't the same thing, and we won't pretend they are. Now, before there was a bracelet, there was a young woman who thought she understood the family she was about to enter. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1st, 1961, into a family that had known the royal family for generations. She grew up at Park House, right on the Sandringham estate, where royal connections weren't distant or unfamiliar. They were part of the furniture. But being comfortable near royalty wasn't the same as knowing how to survive inside the monarchy. The part of Diana's childhood that stayed with her most deeply wasn't the grand surroundings. It was the collapse of her parents' marriage. Her mother and father separated when Diana was still a little girl. The divorce that followed left her caught inside a break she'd later describe as deeply painful. For a child who craved reassurance and closeness, the loss of a settled home left its mark long before any prince entered the picture. What Diana seemed to want most wasn't wealth or status. It was something much simpler, affection she could trust, a home that felt steady, and people who wouldn't suddenly disappear from her life. That desire shaped everything she did next. She moved to London, shared a flat at Coleherne Court with friends, and found work caring for young children at the Young England kindergarten. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't a royal role, and that was part of its appeal. She had friends around her, work she enjoyed, and a front door she could close behind her. That life mattered because it shows what was really at stake when Charles entered the picture. Diana wasn't leaving behind a miserable existence in search of rescue. She was stepping away from a world where she could laugh with friends, care for children, and decide what her day would look like, in exchange for a future she hadn't fully examined. And the man offering that future wasn't arriving with an empty romantic history. Charles and Camilla had known each other since the early 1970s, long before Diana became a serious presence in his life. Their early relationship was romantic. That part isn't something Diana's supporters invented afterward, but the shape of what came next is where the accounts split. Charles's naval service took him away, and in 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. That marriage didn't mean she disappeared from Charles's world. Their circles were small enough that people stayed linked through mutual friends, country gatherings, and years of shared familiarity. Someone who'd once been romantically involved with the Prince of Wales could still appear at social events, and nobody would treat it as remarkable. For Charles, Camilla remained someone who understood his habits, his interests, and the pressures of his position in a way very few people did. His life was full of people who knew the title. Far fewer understood the man behind it, or at least made him feel they did. Camilla had known him before the country settled on Diana as his future wife. She belonged to a part of his private world that had already been taking shape for years. That's what Diana was walking into, even if she didn't fully see it yet. Charles visited Althorpe in November 1977, when Diana was 16. At the time, he was connected to her older sister Sarah, and Diana was simply the younger Spencer sister, part of a family Charles already knew. That first encounter didn't become a romance. Their connection developed more seriously in 1980, after Charles had lived through one of the deepest losses of his life. Lord Mountbatten, his beloved great-uncle and mentor, had been killed by an IRA bombing in August 1979. Diana later recalled that she spoke to Charles about how lonely he'd seemed after Mountbatten's death. She remembered offering sympathy at a moment when she sensed he needed comfort. That detail is important. What drew them together wasn't just family background or public suitability. Diana responded to his vulnerability. Charles responded to her warmth. She wasn't wrong to believe there was genuine feeling between them. The problem was that feeling and readiness for marriage weren't necessarily the same thing. Their relationship moved forward through phone calls, visits, and weekends within the country house world. Both families understood. But it wasn't the kind of courtship that gave them months of ordinary, uninterrupted life together. Charles's schedule was shaped by official duties. Diana's days were becoming increasingly disrupted by press attention, and as photographers began following her everywhere, the outside world started treating the relationship as a national event before the couple had built much privacy around it. Diana later suggested they'd spent surprisingly little time alone together before marriage entered the conversation. They hadn't worked through expectations about loyalty, emotional boundaries, or the continued presence of people from earlier relationships. They hadn't learned how they handled conflict, because they hadn't had enough time together to find any. Charles was weighing whether Diana could stand beside him as queen. Diana was beginning to believe that a man she'd comforted and admired might finally offer the stable family life she'd wanted since childhood. They were moving toward the same decision, but they weren't necessarily moving toward it for the same reasons. And what Diana didn't fully realize was that her growing closeness to Charles was happening inside a circle where Camilla Parker Bowles already knew every rule. Before Charles proposed, Diana had already spent time around Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles at social gatherings. Camilla wasn't treated as an uncomfortable subject. She wasn't a figure from the distant past. She was present, familiar, accepted. And Diana started noticing something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just that Camilla knew Charles, it was how naturally she moved through the space around him. She understood the rhythms of his world. She knew the people he trusted. She seemed at ease with routines Diana was still trying to learn. Diana didn't yet have evidence of anything specific. What she had was a feeling, the kind that sits just below the surface, not strong enough to act on, but too persistent to ignore. Then Charles proposed. He asked Diana to come to Windsor, and there, the future became immediate. Her first reaction wasn't the smooth certainty people might expect from a royal engagement. She later remembered the moment as surprising, emotionally charged, and slightly unreal. She said yes, but accepting the proposal didn't answer any of the questions already forming in the back of her mind. It didn't tell her how much freedom she'd keep, where she'd fit inside Charles's existing world, or whether the woman she'd noticed would step back once a wife arrived. Diana also recalled that during their private conversation, Charles spoke about love in a way that left her unsettled. Something about his emotional language didn't sit comfortably with the commitment she believed they were making. She accepted anyway. She wanted to believe they could build something lasting. And the moment she did, the meaning of their relationship no longer belonged to just the two of them. A future royal marriage was about to become public property. On February 24, 1981, the engagement was announced. Diana was 19, Charles was 32. For much of Britain, the news seemed to answer a question that had hung over the monarchy for years. The Prince of Wales had found his future wife. She was young, warm, aristocratic, and already familiar with royal circles. The public response was enormous. Diana wasn't just being welcomed as Charles's fiancée. She was being measured against the expectations attached to a future queen. Then came the televised engagement interview, and one answer changed the way Diana heard everything Charles had ever said to her. When they were asked whether they were in love, Diana answered without hesitation, "Of course." Charles responded differently. "Whatever in love means." Those words were spoken on camera. They don't depend on somebody remembering a conversation nobody else heard. To the audience at home, the remark could be brushed aside as the slightly awkward phrasing of a man who'd spent his life speaking carefully in public. To Diana, it landed inside a relationship where she was already struggling to understand what Charles meant when he talked about love. That gap between what the cameras showed and what Diana privately felt would become one of the defining fractures of their engagement. The country saw a couple preparing for marriage. Diana was starting to wonder whether they understood marriage in the same way, and the life she'd known was already disappearing. Her flat at Coleherne Court, the shared routines, the familiar friends, couldn't continue now that she was engaged to the heir to the throne. Diana moved into Clarence House, the London residence of the Queen Mother. On paper, it sounded like a gentle introduction to royal life. She'd be inside a secure household while wedding preparations moved forward. Diana remembered it very differently. She described arriving to find no warm welcome waiting for her. Charles wasn't living there. The friends who'd filled her old flat couldn't simply become part of her new household. Police protection had arrived, doors were guarded, and choices she'd once made without thinking now required permission, planning, or explanation. She was protected, but she didn't feel accompanied. That distinction mattered more than anyone around her seemed to realize. She hadn't yet learned the rhythms of royal life. She didn't know when she was expected to speak, how much emotion she could show, or which mistakes would become tomorrow's headline. The palace had solved the practical problem of where Charles's fiancée should live. It hadn't solved her loneliness. And then, among the messages welcoming her into royal life, came one from the woman whose name had already started keeping Diana awake at night. Diana said she found a letter from Camilla Parker Bowles after moving into Clarence House. On the surface, it read as friendly. Camilla congratulated her on the engagement and suggested they have lunch while Charles was away. She also wanted to see the engagement ring. There was nothing openly hostile in the invitation. Diana accepted. What happened during that lunch depends on whose understanding you trust. There's no recording, no neutral transcript. Diana remembered feeling uneasy. One question stayed with her for years. Camilla asked whether Diana planned to hunt once she was married. To someone outside their world, it might sound like ordinary conversation. Hunting was part of Charles's life, and asking whether his fiancée planned to join was hardly unusual. Diana came to believe it meant something more. She answered that she didn't plan to hunt. Looking back, she interpreted Camilla's question as an attempt to find out whether there'd still be opportunities to see Charles during country weekends, without his wife present. That was Diana's reading. Not a confession from Camilla, biographer Penny Junor offered a sharply different interpretation, presenting Camilla as friendly, supportive, even welcoming. Both women may have left that table believing entirely different things had happened. Camilla may have seen it as harmless. Diana may have sensed an emotional boundary that nobody was willing to explain. What matters is this: Diana was about to marry Charles, and she was still trying to judge the importance of a relationship everyone around him seemed to accept without question. She could see that Camilla mattered. What she couldn't yet determine was how much. And once suspicion entered her mind, ordinary moments began carrying a second meaning. A question about hunting no longer sounded like social chatter. Familiarity no longer felt innocent. Even apparent kindness could leave her wondering what remained unsaid. A few weeks later, a photograph taken at an airport gave the public a completely different explanation for Diana's tears, and proved how wide the gap between the public story and the private reality had already become. On March 29, 1981, Charles departed for a 5-week overseas tour. The date is preserved in the Royal Collection's records. Diana went to the airport to see him leave. Photographs captured her in a red coat, visibly crying, as Charles prepared to board. The picture fitted perfectly with the romantic story already building around them. A young fiancée was heartbroken because her prince would be gone for weeks. That was the public reading. It was also incomplete. Years later, Diana said her distress was connected to something that had happened minutes before the cameras caught her face. She recalled being with Charles when Camilla telephoned. Faced with the choice of staying or giving them privacy, Diana said she left the room. She remembered the moment breaking her heart. The photograph can't tell us what was said during that call. It doesn't prove Camilla's reason for phoning. What it captures is a woman in genuine distress, and the explanation Diana gave had nothing to do with missing her fiancé. She was trying to understand why the emotional space around Charles still seemed to include another woman, even after their engagement had supposedly settled his future. To the cameras, her tears confirmed the romance. To Diana, they reflected a fear she couldn't safely explain to anyone who was watching. The same photograph carried two stories, the one Britain wanted and the one Diana said she was already living. While the public saw a lovesick fiancé, Diana was quietly beginning to understand that another woman seemed to appear whenever she looked closely enough. As spring turned toward summer, the royal wedding became almost impossible to escape. Diana's face appeared on commemorative china, mugs, newspapers, magazines, postcards and tea towels. Shops filled with souvenirs before she'd even taken her vows. People weren't just following the engagement, they were buying pieces of it. The ceremony would take place at St. Paul's Cathedral. Security, transport, broadcasting, seating, and public appearances all had to be coordinated. Diana's diary filled with obligations while she was still learning how to perform the role people had already assigned her. David and Elizabeth Emanuel had been chosen to design the wedding dress, silk taffeta, lace, embroidery, and a 25-foot train built for a cathedral ceremony and a global audience. Diana's body, however, was changing under the pressure. In her later recordings, she said her bulimia began shortly after the engagement. She connected the illness to intense anxiety, insecurity, and the sudden loss of control over her life. She described losing weight rapidly. As her measurements shifted, the dress required repeated adjustment. A young woman was becoming physically smaller, while the spectacle built around her grew larger. That contrast was almost invisible to the public. Every new photograph confirmed the fairy tale. Every fitting brought the ceremony closer. Every piece of merchandise suggested the ending had already been written. Diana could smile for the cameras and return to Clarence House feeling uncertain about the man she was marrying. She could be celebrated by strangers and feel completely alone inside a royal residence. And once thousands of guests had been assigned seats, broadcasters had organized worldwide coverage, and her face had become a national emblem. Stepping away no longer felt like a choice between two people. The wedding had developed its own momentum. Diana was no longer simply preparing to marry Charles. She was carrying the hopes of a country that believed it already knew how their story would end. But beneath the fittings and the smiling photographs, the earlier warning signs hadn't disappeared. They were about to become something Diana could hold in her hands. The next warning wasn't a question over lunch or a phone call Diana couldn't hear. It was an object waiting inside a royal household office. Diana later described the discovery in her recorded account. She entered the office, noticed a parcel, and asked the person there what it contained. The reply only made her more determined to look. "You shouldn't look at that." Diana opened it anyway. Inside was a bracelet Charles had ordered for Camilla Parker Bowles. That basic sequence, the parcel, the warning, her decision to inspect it, the shock of discovering who it was for, comes from Diana's account. But another version exists. Penny Junor, drawing on information attributed to Michael Colborne, described the bracelet being left among other farewell gifts Charles had ordered. That shifts the mechanics of the discovery, but it doesn't erase the bracelet itself. Both versions accept that Charles commissioned the jewelry for Camilla and that Diana found it before the wedding. The dispute is about how the package came within Diana's reach and whether it had been deliberately hidden from her. Diana placed the discovery shortly before the wedding. Retellings have compressed the timeline in different ways, sometimes combining the moment she found the bracelet with a separate account of Charles delivering it to Camilla. Those events shouldn't be treated as one scene. The date Diana found the package, the date Charles gave it away, and the date of the wedding rehearsal are three separate points. Blending them makes a better screenplay, but it sacrifices what the evidence actually shows. What can be fixed firmly is Diana's age. She'd turned 20 on July 1, 1981. By the time of the bracelet and the wedding on July 29th, she was 20, not 19, as many accounts still repeat. And there was something painfully ordinary about how the discovery happened. No formal announcement warned Diana that Charles intended to give Camilla a piece of personal jewelry. No one sat her down and explained the relationship. No one offered context. She noticed a parcel. She asked a question. Someone told her she'd be better off not knowing. That warning may have been intended to protect Charles's privacy, to spare Diana's feelings, or to prevent an argument. From Diana's position, it suggested that somebody inside the household already understood the contents would devastate her. And she was right. Morton's published account describes the bracelet as a gold chain with a blue enamel disc. On that disc were two intertwined letters, G and F. It wasn't a design Diana had glimpsed on paper. That version belongs to dramatizations. According to the historical accounts, she found the finished piece. It had been made for Camilla Parker Bowles. Even accounts sympathetic to Charles don't dispute that point. The bracelet wasn't Diana's wedding present. It hadn't been ordered to mark her engagement. Camilla was the intended recipient. And that changed everything, because the bracelet required a kind of intention that none of Diana's earlier suspicions had carried. At lunch, Camilla's question about hunting could be explained as social conversation. The airport phone call could be defended as one friend wishing another well before a long overseas trip. Charles's awkward language about love could be put down to discomfort in front of cameras. The bracelet was different. Someone had chosen the form of the gift. Someone had decided on the inscription. Someone had commissioned it, paid for it, and arranged for it to reach Camilla before the wedding took place. For Diana, the object told her that Camilla remained important enough to receive something deeply personal at the very moment Charles was promising his future to her. The wedding was approaching. Diana was being fitted for a gown that represented permanent commitment, while Charles was preparing a private gift tied to another woman and to a relationship that predated her. Now, those two intertwined letters. This is where the story splits, and most retellings pick only one version. In Diana's account, G and F stood for Gladys and Fred, private nicknames used by Camilla and Charles. Under that reading, the bracelet wasn't a generous farewell. It was evidence of an enclosed emotional world, complete with private names, shared identity, and a bond the future bride could recognize but never enter. Michael Colborne reportedly gave Penny Junor a different explanation. According to that account, the letters referred to Girl Friday, a nickname Charles used for Camilla, describing a dependable woman who helps and organizes. Under that reading, the inscription still reflected closeness, but it didn't represent matching pet names for a romantic couple. The available evidence doesn't allow either side to settle the case. There's no note from Charles attached to the commission defining the initials beyond dispute. What remain are competing explanations tied to people who understood the relationship differently. But here's what rarely gets said clearly enough. Even the more innocent interpretation leaves one fact untouched. Whether the letters represented two private nicknames or one affectionate title, they weren't impersonal. The personalized gift was still for Camilla. It was still commissioned before the wedding. And it still carried an inscription rooted in private familiarity. Correcting the initials doesn't make Diana's distress disappear. If Gladys and Fred was her mistaken interpretation, she still found a personalized bracelet commissioned for Charles's former romantic partner just days before their wedding. If it was a farewell present, she still had to decide whether jewelry carrying an intimate inscription felt like closure, or like a bond that didn't need to end because it had never really been interrupted. If you'd found a bracelet your fiancé had made for another woman just days before your wedding, would you have accepted the explanation that it was simply a goodbye? Or would those engraved initials have told you something very different? Share your honest thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters here, and if you believe Diana's story deserves to be told through her own words and verified facts, please like this video and subscribe. It helps more people discover what really happened behind the headlines. Now, let's look at why Charles's explanation still didn't answer Diana's biggest question. Charles's side did eventually present an explanation, and it wasn't unreasonable. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography described the bracelet as a farewell gift. Charles was closing a chapter before marriage, not continuing an affair behind Diana's back. Penny Junor added further context, writing that Charles had ordered gifts for several women who'd been important to him, marking the end of his bachelor life. Camilla wasn't the only recipient. The bracelet belonged to a group of parting gestures rather than a secret promise to one woman. That explanation is possible. People do give meaningful presents when a period of their life is ending, but the intention of the giver isn't the only part of the story. Charles may have understood the bracelet as closure. Diana encountered it as evidence that Camilla remained emotionally central at the worst possible moment. A farewell gift may explain Charles's thinking. It doesn't prove the farewell felt final to Diana, or that the emotional bond disappeared once the bracelet changed hands. One account places Charles delivering the bracelet personally to Camilla on Monday, July 27th, 2 days before the wedding. Whether or not Diana discovered it that same day, whether it happened earlier, whether she saw him leave, the precise choreography matters less than the weight of the decision itself. Charles went ahead with giving it to her, and if Diana had already objected, that meant her objection hadn't changed his mind. To Diana, the logic created a devastating question. Why did ending the relationship require an intimate, personalized gift so close to the wedding? And why was the emotional comfort of a former lover being protected, while the future bride was left to absorb the pain alone? That's the question the competing accounts have never fully settled. The bracelet existed. Diana's hurt was real. Charles's farewell explanation may have been sincere. But sincerity and sufficiency are not the same thing. I can't marry him. I can't do this. That was how Diana remembered speaking to her sisters after the bracelet pushed her doubts past anything she could contain. She didn't go to a palace official. She didn't call a constitutional advisor. She turned to the people who'd known her before the engagement changed her life. Diana wanted them to understand this wasn't ordinary bridal nerves. The gift Charles intended for Camilla had left her questioning whether she could walk into the marriage at all. Their response became one of the most quietly devastating details in her entire account. They reminded her that her face was already on the commemorative tea towels. The message, as Diana received it, was that she'd left it too late to back out. The remark may have been humor. It may have reflected resignation, embarrassment, or a practical belief that the wedding had simply grown too large for anyone to stop. But to Diana, it landed as something far more painful. Her private distress was being weighed against a public celebration already in motion. The souvenirs had been printed. The invitations had gone out. Streets were being prepared. Britain believed it was about to witness a romance that belonged to everybody. And Diana felt as though there wasn't room inside that story for the bride to say she wasn't sure. She didn't formally try to cancel the wedding. There's no reliable evidence of palace officials drafting an announcement, no documented constitutional emergency, no queen ordering Diana to proceed. Those additions make the story more dramatic. They aren't supported by Diana's own account. The truth is more personal, and in some ways, harder to bear. She reached the point of saying she couldn't go through with the marriage. Then she discovered that everyone around her seemed to believe the decision had already been made for her. That's what it means to say the bracelet nearly stopped the wedding. It brought Diana to an emotional breaking point. The ceremony continued because nobody offered her a clear path out. Whether her sisters believed they were calming her or simply accepting the inevitable, their answer left Diana facing the same question alone. Could she trust the marriage enough to step inside it? The calendar moved forward before she found an answer. On Monday, July 27th, Diana walked into St. Paul's Cathedral for the wedding rehearsal. The ceremony was 2 days away. Until then, parts of the wedding could still feel like separate problems. The fittings, the schedules, the conversations she couldn't stop replaying in her mind. Inside the cathedral, those pieces came together. St. Paul's wasn't simply a beautiful church chosen for a family occasion. Its enormous interior, long central aisle, and broadcasting arrangements made the scale of what Diana was about to do physically impossible to ignore. The lights were there. The cameras were being positioned. Every movement she'd make on Wednesday was being mapped for an audience of hundreds of millions. Diana later recalled breaking down around the rehearsal. She connected her distress to everything that had built throughout the engagement: the isolation, the loss of her old life, her deteriorating health, the bracelet, the fear that nobody around her understood how frightened she truly felt. There's no authenticated account of Princess Margaret stepping in to halt the proceedings. No reliable evidence of the Queen holding an emergency meeting. No dramatic confrontation between Charles and Camilla behind closed doors. Those scenes belong to dramatized versions of the story. Diana's own account needs none of them. What she described was quieter and, in its way, more damaging. She was standing inside the building where she'd soon promise her life to Charles. The people around her knew the route down the aisle. They knew where the cameras would go. They knew how the ceremony would run. Diana still didn't know whether the man waiting at the altar had emotionally finished with the woman whose bracelet was already on its way. The rehearsal moved forward. Diana moved with it. That was the most unsettling part. The machinery of the wedding kept running while the bride was struggling to hold herself together. By Tuesday evening, Charles sent Diana a gesture meant to steady her. It arrived alongside evidence that steadying her wasn't enough. The ceremony was now only hours away. Charles sent Diana a signet ring bearing the Prince of Wales's feathers, along with a message she later remembered as encouraging and affectionate. He told her he was proud of her. He said he'd be waiting for her at the altar. That gesture matters because it complicates the simplest version of this story. Charles didn't disappear into indifference the night before his wedding. According to Diana's own account, he reached out with a personal gift and words meant to reassure her. Ignoring that would make the narrative simpler. It wouldn't make it more truthful. The ring carried the Prince of Wales's emblem, linking Diana directly to the life she was about to enter. The contrast with Camilla's bracelet is impossible to miss. But the two gifts shouldn't be forced into a false choice between absolute devotion and absolute betrayal. Charles could offer genuine reassurance to Diana, while still failing to understand how deeply his attachment to Camilla had shaken her. And Diana could appreciate his message without recovering her confidence. She also recalled her eating disorder continuing that night. The public knew nothing about that private struggle. Outside, anticipation was building. Inside Clarence's house, Diana was fighting a battle the cameras would never see. Her sister's presence gave her company. It didn't answer the question that had followed her through the final days before the ceremony. Was Charles offering her the security she needed, or simply the reassurance required to get her to the altar? By morning, there was no more time to search for the answer. Wednesday, July 29th, 1981, arrived beneath a level of public attention few weddings had ever received. Diana was 20, Charles was 32. The ceremony took place at St. Paul's Cathedral. David and Elizabeth Emanuel's gown, with its 25-foot train, made its entrance beneath the Spencer family tiara, a piece of Diana's own history carried into the royal ceremony. Crowds packed the streets. Across the world, the combined television and radio audience reached roughly 1 billion people. Diana moved toward the altar, knowing the moment belonged not only to her and Charles, but to an audience that had invested their hopes in the picture before them. And then she saw Camilla. In her later recollection, Diana said she noticed Camilla among the congregation. She remembered a pale outfit and a small hat with a veil. The image stayed with her because Camilla was no longer an abstract worry, a name carried on somebody else's breath. She was there, inside the same cathedral where Diana was about to promise her life to Charles. Her presence didn't prove a continuing affair. Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles belonged to the couple's social circle. Her attendance at the wedding was expected. But Diana's memory tells us what the sight meant to her. It confirmed that Camilla hadn't disappeared from the story simply because the bride had arrived. Still, Diana didn't describe the wedding as a scene of total emptiness. She also remembered affection, excitement, and the warmth coming from the crowds. She believed there was hope. She wanted the love she felt for Charles to lead somewhere better than the fears she'd carried into the cathedral. Even her nerves became visible when she mixed up the order of Charles's first names during the vows, a human moment inside a ceremony polished for the world. Diana wasn't standing there as a symbol, a warning, or a character in a story whose ending she already knew. She was a young woman making a real commitment while holding contradictory emotions at once. She could feel loved by the crowd and unsettled by one familiar face. She could welcome Charles's reassurance and remain troubled by the bracelet. She could hope the wedding marked a beginning, while fearing something older hadn't truly ended. The ceremony went ahead. Charles and Diana became husband and wife. Outside, the public celebrated what looked like the completion of a fairy tale. Inside Diana's mind, the question raised by the bracelet hadn't been resolved. It had simply crossed the threshold with her. The vows were spoken. The crowds believed the difficult part was over. Diana was about to discover that the bracelet's shadow had followed her out of England entirely. After the wedding, Charles and Diana began their honeymoon at Broadlands in Hampshire, then travelled to Gibraltar and boarded the royal yacht Britannia for a 12-day Mediterranean cruise before ending with a stay at Balmoral. The official itinerary reads like the perfect start to married life. Diana remembered something very different unfolding beneath that surface. During the honeymoon, she said she came across photographs of Camilla while looking through Charles's belongings. They weren't images Diana had expected to find among the things her new husband had brought into their first days of marriage. A photograph doesn't prove an affair. But Diana understood those pictures through everything that had already happened. Camilla wasn't staying behind in England as a closed chapter. In Diana's eyes, she'd followed them into the marriage through the objects Charles carried with him. Then came something else. Diana noticed Charles wearing cufflinks decorated with 2 intertwined letter C's. She said she asked whether Camilla had given them to him. Charles replied that they were a gift from a friend. Diana wasn't reassured. To her, the initials appeared to represent Charles and Camilla, their letters joined together, on something Charles wore during his honeymoon with another woman. She said they argued, and the direction of the gifts now told its own story. Before the wedding, Charles had sent a personalized bracelet toward Camilla. After the wedding, Diana believed Charles was wearing a personalized gift that had come back from Camilla. One object moved toward her. The other returned from her. For Diana, the exchange suggested an attachment that couldn't be dismissed as one awkward farewell. She felt surrounded by evidence that Charles and Camilla shared a private language, symbols, names, initials, that existed before her and showed no sign of ending because of her. Diana had entered the wedding hoping the ceremony might draw a line beneath her fears. Instead, she found photographs and jewelry that made her believe the line had never been drawn at all. Britannia was carrying the newlywed couple through a honeymoon, the world viewed as romantic triumph. Diana said she was struggling to believe she had her husband's full emotional attention. She also recalled that her eating disorder continued during this period. The wedding hadn't removed the anxiety behind it, and the honeymoon didn't deliver the safety she'd hoped marriage would bring. By the time they reached Balmoral, the question that began before the ceremony still hadn't gone away. If the bracelet was supposed to represent a goodbye, why did Diana feel that Camilla had followed her into every room of her marriage? Years would pass before Diana addressed Camilla directly. When she finally did, the fear behind that bracelet had become something she could put into words, and she wasn't afraid to use them. In 1989, Diana attended a birthday gathering for Camilla's sister. By then, she was no longer the uncertain young bride, asking her family whether she could escape the wedding. She was a mother, a senior member of the royal family, and a woman who believed the problem she'd sensed before her marriage had never truly disappeared. Diana later described deciding she couldn't leave the gathering without speaking to Camilla. She asked for a private conversation. According to Diana, she told Camilla that she knew what was happening between her and Charles. In that account, Camilla suggested Diana already had the admiration of the public and the family life many people envied. Diana's answer cut through everything else. "I want my husband." Those 4 words matter because they reveal what the argument had always been about. It was never simply about jewelry, social access, or the discomfort of seeing Charles remain close to someone from his past. Diana believed that the emotional center of her marriage had been shared with another woman from the very beginning. By confronting Camilla, she was finally saying aloud what she hadn't been able to resolve before walking into St. Paul's Cathedral 8 years earlier. At 20, she'd asked her sisters for help and been told it was too late. At 28, she addressed Camilla herself. That shift didn't repair the marriage. But it changed the position from which Diana would eventually tell her story. She was no longer prepared to let everyone else decide what her silence meant. Diana eventually decided that if anyone was going to understand what happened before her wedding, the story couldn't stay trapped inside private conversations and polite silences. In 1991, she began answering questions arranged through Dr. James Coldhurst. The answers were recorded and passed to Andrew Morton. The arrangement allowed Diana to speak without publicly revealing that she was the source. She described her childhood, the engagement, the marriage, the illness, and the role she believed Camilla had played throughout. Among those memories was the bracelet. In 1992, Morton published the book. Its impact came from the distance between the public image of Diana's marriage and the experiences described inside its pages. Then Charles presented his side. In 1994, he took part in a televised interview with Jonathan Dimbleby. Asked about faithfulness, Charles acknowledged that he hadn't remained faithful, but only after the relationship had, in his words, irretrievably broken down. That admission confirmed marital infidelity. It didn't establish that Charles was having a physical affair before the wedding or during the honeymoon. His explanation placed the breakdown of the marriage before the unfaithfulness. Diana's account showed she'd feared Camilla's influence from the very beginning. Those positions aren't identical, and the bracelet, the object at the center of this story, sits between them, carrying a meaning neither side has ever been able to claim completely. For Charles's supporters, it was a farewell misunderstood. For Diana, it was the first solid proof that her marriage might never belong entirely to the two people who stood at the altar. After all the competing accounts, one fact survives every version: the bracelet existed. Charles commissioned it for Camilla. Diana discovered it before their wedding. The engraved initials have never been explained in a way that settles every disagreement. Charles's side described it as a farewell gift. Diana understood it as evidence that an emotional attachment hadn't ended. She said the discovery left her so distressed that she told her sisters she couldn't go through with the wedding. She didn't formally attempt to cancel the ceremony. No documented palace crisis followed. What happened was quieter, and in some ways, more painful. She voiced a serious fear and discovered that the wedding had already grown too large for anyone to stop and listen. On December 9, 1992, Prime Minister John Major announced Charles and Diana's separation in Parliament. The marriage ended on August 28, 1996. Those dates belong to the public record. Diana's feelings belong to her own testimony. They're different kinds of evidence, but together, they reveal something the wedding photographs could never show. The young woman, walking toward the altar, wasn't entering marriage without doubts. She was carrying questions she hoped love, time, and commitment might eventually answer. Perhaps what Diana deserved to hear in those final days wasn't that her face was already on the tea towels. Perhaps it was that her fears mattered more than the souvenirs, more than the headlines, more than the expectations of 1 billion people watching. And that's where this story should leave her, not as a symbol of tragedy, not as a helpless figure trapped inside somebody else's version of events, but alive, stepping into St. Paul's beneath the Spencer tiara, hearing the crowds cheer, carrying every fear and every hope at once, and still believing, despite the bracelet, despite the phone calls, despite the letters she shouldn't have read, that her future might hold the affection she'd spent her whole life looking for. There's another overlooked moment from Diana's early marriage that reveals just how different her public happiness was from what really happened behind closed doors. If you want that story, subscribe, and meet me in the next video.